Hello, everyone. We are back today to discuss some of the follow-up questions from the webinar, Breaking It Down, Best Practices for Simplifying Your Retention Schedule. I'm Michelle Lynch, the Marketing and Communication Specialist at Zasio, and will be your moderator for today's session. For today's Q&A session, we are joined again by subject matter experts Warren Bean, Senior Sales Engineer at Zasio, Jennifer Chadband, Senior Analyst and Licensed Attorney at Zasio, and Rick Serber, who is also a Senior Analyst and Licensed Attorney at Zasio. Welcome back, everyone.
Good to be here.
Thanks.
We've grouped the questions that came in during the original session into 7 different sections to help keep things organized and easy to follow. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right into the first section, Breaking It Down, Record Retention Simplification, Presentation Recap, and Efforts to Optimize. I will go ahead and turn it over to our panelists.
Thanks, Michelle. So all of you should have watched the prior webinar, Breaking It Down, Best Practices for Simplifying Your Retention Schedule, either live or maybe as a recording later. If not, Google that title and watch it on YouTube first, because this follow-up Q&A won't make any sense. For context and to get us back all in the thought process, we broke it down as close to a workshop as we could using a webinar presentation to discuss our records retention schedule, simplification techniques, some pain points, and a bunch of solutions. And so there were nearly 100 questions asked during the presentation, and we were only able to touch on about a third of them live. So this is the follow-up to address the remaining questions. For some of those questions, we're going to be reading them as they were written in the Q&A box during the presentation. For many, we're just going to broadly kind of describe the question because it was asked multiple times in multiple different ways, and so we'll summarize it. And we also group them all together to try to create a better flow. So getting us started off, I thought one of the questions that really hit well and would be a good one to lead off on is the amount of effort it takes to optimize a records retention schedule. My answer is that's all going to depend on what type of shape your records retention schedule is in and the goals for the desired state. And so, for example, if your records retention schedule has been reasonably well maintained, it's already a functional schedule, there's already been effort to reduce the number of categories to kind of follow a big bucket approach, we could be talking about a few weeks to optimize, and that's assuming a small number of jurisdictions to be researched and recommendations provided based on those legal requirements that are discovered. On the other side of that equation, for an outdated retention schedule that's departmentally organized, granular, we're talking probably months worth of work. We'll likely have to contact stakeholders to get more information about the records if things are stale, which adds time, and then adding research jurisdictions will add additional time to that. And so, and also the complexity of the industry that you're in is gonna play a part as well. So a major RRS overhaul in a complex industry like financial services with an international research scope, that type of project could easily run 9 months to a year, if not longer. And that's for us here at Zasio doing it. This is kind of our bread and butter, so we do it all the time. It might take longer if you're spearheading that effort with your RIM team. So for the next question, we got a question that kind of goes to the bucketing, approach, and it's a good example, I think. It was for general accounting records, why not just group one category of records at 7 years and all others in another category? And so if that approach covers your operational needs and it covers the legal requirements in your jurisdictions, it might be feasible. And most clients do take an approach where you group most general accounting records in one place with carve-outs from that based on laws and operational needs. So I think that thinking is in the right direction, but the retention period is going to depend on your jurisdiction. So, for example, many companies with a large footprint in Europe will harmonize to 11 years for accounting records to manage really broad accounting requirements in the EU jurisdictions. And so If the EU is just a subset or a footprint of your jurisdictions, maybe a regional retention at 11 and a lower retention for the rest of the world makes sense. But it's all gonna depend on your operational needs. A big part of it's gonna depend on your jurisdictions, and it needs to be optimized for your situation.
All right. I'll kind of take on this next question we had. I loved actually seeing this question because it kind of indicated to me that people were really kind of looking at our examples of consolidation in a very I don't want to say critical, but people were definitely, kind of thinking of different ideas. How could we do this? How could you do that? For this example, we talked about a workers' compensation claim record series set at 18 years. And it was really an example to illustrate how you are looking at a New York requirement of 18 years, and do you really want to set your entire global schedule for this record series that involves potentially sensitive information at 18 years? Does that make sense? So we talked about reducing that and maybe creating an exception for New York. And the question was, if it's active +6 for workers' comp, can it just go under litigation? There's different approaches for that. And I really like, as I said, I like that this person kind of thought about this, because it's a little bit like Tetris sometimes, looking at this and organizing and reorganizing and thinking of things in different ways. And I think certainly, that is something that could go under litigation. We see it under litigation. It's also something, workers' comp tends to be something that can fall under different functions for different reasons. Sometimes we see it like in a risk function. Sometimes we see it under finance for some reason, and that's, I think, reflective of how that organization kind of views that process and really where it falls under. We also see it under legal. And so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's options. And when you're looking at consolidating different record series, what might be the perfect, idea for one organization may not be for another. But certainly looking at that big bucket option, because this involves essentially a claim. If you have a record series that says like litigation, arbitration claim, something along those lines, and an active +6 makes sense, absolutely you can go ahead and do big bucket on that. So yeah, that was a really great question.
One thing to add to that, Jen, keep in mind though that if you do group it under litigation and you have a jurisdictional exception for New York, like we talked about at 18, then you're getting into a situation where you might want to create a record-specific jurisdictional exception to that litigation category for workers' compensation versus a jurisdictional exception for that whole litigation category, because you don't want to over retain the rest of those litigation records for 18 years in line with New York's requirement. So,
sure,
it kind of demonstrates how consolidating and mixing the records together in these big buckets creates these situations for the exceptions where at times, record-specific exceptions may be necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Record-specific exceptions, as we kind of talked about in the example, creating an exception for New York, you can refine that and make sure it's only specific to workers' comp records. So it allows you some flexibility. It just depends, does that make sense? Do you find that retention period to start to get too complex? And then under that analysis, go big bucket, or does it make more sense to keep it separate? And then we have, going on to our next section, we have the RRS mechanics. And this is under section 2, our categories of kind of bucketed questions that we got. It says, explain the difference between the function column and the title column. Is the function/area responsible for the record? So I think this kind of goes to, it'd be helpful just to explain just a little bit of why, we title it function, and then, what that represents versus the record series. The function is supposed to kind of represent the high level business processes of the organization. And then the titles get more into, representative, processes, a brief description of a process that kind of falls under that, that function. So it as to if the function / area is responsible for the record, yes, but I would say that a function that doesn't necessarily kind of designate who might be responsible for a record. I would say, to one of our prior examples, when we looked at the invoices, a function might be accounting and finance, but we also recognize that, invoices come from many different business areas throughout the organization. So there's many different owners, and that an owner of an invoice might be in sales and marketing in relation to a sales of a product. Nonetheless, that record will fall under that higher level functional area. So I would say there's a possibility that yes, that happens to align, but because we're looking at a functional schedule, various business areas might have ownership over records under a particular function.
Jen, I would even add to that, that over the course of time, one of the drivers behind moving from departmental to functional has been due to the fact that there were constant reorganizations of departmental structures and who reports to who, which made it really difficult to keep track of, the data owners. And so by going to a functional schedule, it really eliminates a lot of that constant shift and reassignment of those record types.
Yeah, that's a good point, Warren. Absolutely. Another great question I think that we had, and I had to kind of think about this, is do you need a record code? I would say that industry best practice certainly is for each record retention schedule series is to assign it a unique alphanumeric code. Alphanumeric is kind of the industry standard best practice. That's what we recommend. And really what it provides is a unique identifier for each of those record series. And I think we see our clients really kind of leverage and use those identifiers in different ways. It's a more concise way of kind of tracking each of the record series. I know that for filing systems, aligning it with various systems, those alphanumeric codes can come in handy. And it's really something that remains static for that record series because, this is a living document, of course, but, when you have a record code that represents a series, that will not change. The title might get tweaked a little bit, to some degree, or the examples might change or the description, but you have something that's static that you can always use to keep track of that record series. And, it provides flexibility too, even though it's kind of static, you can always add new codes, a new alphanumeric code that kind of fits within, however you've titled those. And so there's some flexibility there. And I would add, I actually just kind of want to ask Warren, with your experience with clients, what sort of unique significance on the software side do you see the records retention schedule codes carry?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, Jen, it's a good way to just have a unique reference, although in the database itself, it's not required because we have unique indexes that track the records themselves. The titles that can be unique as well. But really, it's just a good shorthand reference, especially if you have to reference maybe something that was deprecated at some point, and so you want to say that this record code now references these two others. It's a lot easier to have a shorthand code for that than trying to spell out the entire title. So it's really just a way to quickly reference thing, almost something like an icon on your desktop. References a program in a way.
Absolutely. I say, working with various client schedules, I gain such a deep familiarity with them that I remember what a record series is. And when we talk about it, we actually talk about, it's regulatory, it's Reg 100, remember Reg 100, so it's an easy way to kind of memorize. And I think end users also absorb the record series in a more simplified way, because they start to recognize those record series where they have, affect or relate to records that they have ownership over. And I think it's an easy way to kind of remember and reference as well. We had one comment come in from an end user too. And I don't know if you wanted to talk about this too, Rick, but it goes to the mechanics and coding and kind of goes to how they just have decided how to organize their schedule.
Yeah, I was just going to read it off. This is exactly aligned with the broad functional classification system that I've developed over the years. Excellent. One thing I note is that it's helpful to have groups within the code. For example, ACF 5, accounts payable, tax, accounts receivable, etc., which doesn't affect the retention, but is for organizing the files. And yeah, I mean, coding is a great way to group similar items within a function together that wouldn't normally fall together if they were just alphabetized, or, it'll keep them aligned and organized that way. And so, for example, many clients organize their HR category to follow the recruitment, employment, and termination cycle of employees. So, for example, they could have a recruitment code at HUM 15, an employment eligibility code at HUM 20, and a personnel file at HUM 25. And so I think it is useful to group these items together and make the schedule more intuitive the way that it's organized. And you noticed how in that example I counted by fives. We normally do this when we're creating retention schedules for clients, because that allows you to add related categories of records if they come up next to the ones that they go with. And so, yeah, we recommend using these codes for all the reasons listed, and counting by fives or leaving space between the two numbers to add new categories of records where it's needed. Okay, so the next one kind of discusses the mechanics as far as paper versus electronic goes. How can you consolidate this scheme when you have one tier for physical records and a bucket retention for ECM? And my comment here is consider consolidating to remove the distinction between paper versus electronic records in the records retention schedule. I think that that's probably going to create some duplication and make your retention schedule longer than it needs to be. That type of record specific distinction, I think, is better managed within an inventory or a file plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about inventories and file plans in a subsequent question.
Yeah, Rick, I would add to that that I don't see as much distinction now with regard to keeping one format longer than another, except maybe cases where there's a specific formatting requirement from a legal perspective. But I used to see that a lot more when people weren't sure if they could, scan a record and keep it electronically and get rid of the paper. And I would say that the prevalence of that is much less now than we used to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are still some jurisdictional requirements to keep different records in paper form. It's much more rare than it used to be. The trend is for laws that specify that an electronic version has the same weight as a paper version as long as certain conditions are met. So we do within versatile retention track format requirements, and we have a special way to indicate ones that are mandatory, that mandate a specific format. And so that's something that within versatile retention, you can link to the category, and maybe you can have a special field within your retention schedule that notes that within a jurisdiction, certain types of records need to be kept in a certain format. And then the next one, it's related. What's your take on indicating the format/platform of the records, how to pull it off in hybrid environments? And like I just mentioned, a lot of people track that in a field or a user-defined field within versatile retention is what we call it, that kind of notes what formats the records have. Now, keep in mind that if you have a big bucket records retention schedule, it's just going to have to be a listing that covers all the records within a bucket. So a listing of either the platform or a listing of the format or something like that, or location. If granularity is needed to tie specific records to specific formats or specific platforms within a category, we recommend a records inventory or a file plan or even potentially a data map, things like that to go more granular and really track that type of information, keeping the records retention schedule kind of as simple and as that kind of hardline policy that end users can follow.
I agree. Looks like the next one is in my camp. So this one is about, in a similar way, how do you track the system of record for a given record category? And so that sort of ties again into format or storage or kind of how you understand the details of the record. And for this, I'm going to share my screen and just show how we do that in the software, just to give the best example of that. So here you should be about seeing my screen showing the versatile retention application. So in this example, if I go into schedules, we have the ability to do a lot with regard to additional metadata fields. And I'm going to just grab one of my existing items here. And we've got a number of ways to work with user-defined fields, but essentially I'm just looking at general accounting here. I've got a tab for user-defined fields where I can have things like what systems this record might be stored in and what examples it might have as far as document types. So this is the type of thing where we can add as many of these types of fields as we need to. And in this case, things like that might be a pick list that you define and have users available to select whatever applicable systems might be used for the system of record. So a lot of flexibility there, and just gives you an easy way to not only note that on the record type itself, but also if you wanted to search by that, then you can search either with that name in that field using something like the all field search, or you can search specifically on that in any of these user-defined fields and say, well, I'm looking for everything where we might have something in SAP, for example, and find all the records that are related to that. So it's a great way to be able to quickly locate records that might be in these different systems, as well as when you're looking at a record type, know where you're going to find records of that sort. So that's just a good example of how we can use those. Michelle, I will give it back to you.
So moving on to our next question we had. What are the trends in discarding physical employee files if the original employee file has been scanned to electronic format? This is a very common question that we get from clients, not even just specific to employee files, but their records in general, anything that they have scanned. And we do conduct a lot of research on this. Our database has, a ton of different, wet signature requirements, hard copy requirements versus electronic requirements across the jurisdictions that we have, over 130. So this is something that we look into in detail for our clients. And so generally, I think what our clients do in considering all the research is that electronic format is a permissible format, and it will carry a similar kind of evidentiary weight as a hard copy. Now, there are definitely carve-outs to that across the jurisdictions. We actually see jurisdictions that are now, particularly in some of the Eastern European jurisdictions, Russia, where they're actually requiring a certain format for employee records, including electronic. And also there's carve-outs for some jurisdictions with regard to employment contracts, that they want that in hard copy with a wet signature. And so typically the approach is for the employee records is that the electronic format generally is permissible. We don't really need to, there's not a need to keep that physical copy. However, they're also kind of looking to make sure we're considering all of the jurisdictions. Is there anything kind of an outlier here that we need to consider in that regard? So I would say that's typically kind of the trend, and electronic, it tends to be pretty reliable and more common. We have another question, and it was an example of a conflict between regulations, and I believe this was kind of provided in the context of privacy. You might have a privacy requirement that would conflict with a law. We definitely see this, a lot of what we call the compelled privacy requirements, they require a shorter period of time for records or a maximum period of time. Whereas you might have a legal requirement that's saying actually, you need to keep it this long, and there's a conflict, and it might even be a conflict within a relevant jurisdiction. I'll give you an example. So biometrics, really kind of trending internationally, domestically, big deal. More and more jurisdictions are enacting laws. In fact, Illinois has a law no longer than 3 years, essentially, for employee fingerprints after the termination of employment. Texas also has one no longer than 1 year. Now, this may conflict, in particular, the Texas one, with there's regulatory requirements for certain industries where you need to keep employee fingerprints. FINRA for broker dealers, for example, you need to keep a record of those fingerprints for a certain amount of time. And so you have a broker dealer in Texas and you're keeping their fingerprints there. You've got two laws that conflict. Now, typically, these laws will allow for kind of a carve out for, unless there's another legal requirement that kind of, requires something longer. So that's an example. Utah requires information collected about applicants to be kept no longer than 2 years after the decision is made about that applicant. Now, clients that we have that are government service contractors will say we have to keep those applicant records of non-hires for 3 years. Pursuant to our kind of very specific EEO obligations. And so there you've got a conflict there, and we see our clients where there's a conflict end up retaining. The Utah law doesn't have a carve out to keep longer. So I think that privacy analysis definitely, you kind of do have to get into the weeds there and look through the laws and see which law will trump the other when you have conflicts, and whether there's a carve out that allows for that. And then we have another question that kind of feeds into this. And Rick, I think you were going to address this next one on a compendium.
Yeah, the question, is there a compendium where legislation that determines records retention can be referenced? I am sorry to report that, to my knowledge, there's no free compendium of record keeping requirements. We're going to have a shameless plug here. However, Zasio's versatile retention software includes a database of record keeping requirements, along with robust search capabilities and an analysis of each legal requirement, breaking down who is regulated, what records are regulated, and the retention period. And so it allows you to import your records retention schedule and link the requirements directly to your categories of records. So I think it's better than a compendium, and it's a great kind of resource that's a great deal if you can take the time to link the legal requirements to your records retention schedule and keep it maintained. And if you don't have time for that, our consulting team can help you out with that. So.
Yep, that's a good point, Rick, because that's kind of the reason we actually developed this system is because there are just so many sources and so many ways that you can go about trying to find that, none of which are exhaustive or conclusive. So hence the tool.
Yep. Yeah, I should have mentioned that there are over 130,000 citations in our database. That's US and domestic, and that just domestic, there are over 60,000. So yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot, and I don't think that if you did find a compendium that's free, I don't think that they would keep it updated, and I don't know that it would be as reliable as versatile retention.
Nor as focused, because it would probably be a lot of different laws and regulations.
Right.
And speaking of citations, the next question deals with where are the citations located and how do you consolidate and keep them tied to the actual document. So here again, I think showing is going to be the best way to work with this. So let me share my screen again, and I'll show you a couple of different examples of that. And there it is. So in terms of the location of the citations themselves, again, it's part of our tool, so it's in the database that the tool accesses. So in this case, I'm showing you the software as a service version, so the database itself is located in the cloud. But just going into the research tab, I wanted to just kind of take an example of how you can do that kind of searching through the tool. So as an example, if you're looking for regulations in a specific jurisdiction, you might have those jurisdictions carved out per your retention schedule. I'm going to just use some general ones here and say, let's assume that we're looking for regulations in Australia, and we want to look for things related to kind of common business activities, maybe accounting, something like that. And I could have, I could add keywords in there and so forth if I wanted to, but we'll just keep it simple for today. So this would be a way to search on the jurisdiction and the topic, in this case accounting, and find, in this case, about 343 items related to that topic in that jurisdiction. So each one of these items here is all the detail in terms of descriptions and requirements and details and text and so forth. So that's one way that I can search that. And then to kind of tie that into how do you keep that associated or grouped with the specific document types, that's where I can take any of these items and select them and link them to my schedule. So by selecting the ones that I find that are relevant, I can then go to the link option and choose where I want to link those. And I'm going to just do some sort of arbitrary ones here because they're probably not really, I'm going to just say these are related to general finance, and link those items to that finance record. Or in this case, that one is already under change request, so I will link it to another one. And so now those 3 items have been linked to a particular part of my schedule, and I can verify that by going to the schedule and see, yep, indeed, it is now linked to accounting finance as far as the department, general accounting as far as the schedule. And if I wanted to look at that detail, we're now switching over from the research side to the actual schedule. And so we're now on that general accounting schedule, and we see, indeed, here are the items that I linked under my citation tab. So this is how we can tie them to the specific record type. So we always have that as a reference to say, what are the legal requirements that we are saying are applicable to this category of records? And generally taking the various references to retention periods here and coming up with a retention period that works within those legal boundaries as well as those operational requirements. So hopefully that demonstrates how that works and where those are stored.
All right, so I think we're going to transition into our next category. Should be section 3, event triggers. So a lot of chatter on the event triggers, and it's just kind of interesting how controversial or how many questions can come up surrounding is creation appropriate versus active. Event triggers, I think, just to kind of preface some of these questions and the conversation, they really should be as clear as possible. And even when they're as clear as possible, they also need to be defined very clearly. So event triggers, innately, they should be, fairly intuitive. They should not leave too much discretion to the end users and how they interpret it. And they should be also, part of training, helping people to understand, as part of the training and making sure that they're clearly defined. And so they have those resources. When you get down to, what creation date, our first one says, I've seen the trigger creation date or date created used in other schedules. Is there a concern that those terms mean something different to an end user versus a records manager? So that's a great question. Absolutely, that could be the case. So, the solution is that you need to be consistent in how you use that term, and it needs to be clearly defined. One thing that we kind of recommend, and we see, some of our clients might even not have an event trigger of creation. They might just have something that says 5 years. Not creation plus 5 years, or they could have something that says creation plus 5 years, or it could be calendar year plus 5 years. How are you going to define this? So, one thing I think that is helpful is to be all encompassing here. So if you want to define it, creation, it could be that the retention period is triggered at the end of the calendar year in which the record is created or captured. So that definition kind of, encapsulates all these various items, which kind of goes to, we had another question, does creation mean when it's actually officially declared a record and captured, or does it mean when it's actually created? So how can you kind of structure your definitions, event trigger titles to be intuitive and provide, really decisive direction for end users? When do you use creation date plus number of years? That kind of goes to this this definition that I just provided. Where can you be kind of all inclusive with your definition? Creation can mean this, but make sure you're including kind of all the contingencies that fall within that. Whether you decide to do calendar year, whether you decide to use creation, or just list it as 5 years, for example. How are you going to define when that within your definitions? Also, we had somebody comment, I have used C as current year instead of an event trigger. So again, somebody is deciding to kind of define it in their unique way, and that's fine. As long as you're consistent, as long as you have it defined, as long as it's decisive and it's kind of inclusive for the different circumstances that might fall within that event trigger. Also, they mentioned I use E as an event trigger for examples for contracts and agreement, which means E equals expiry of contract or agreement. And so absolutely, there's kind of that distinction there. And as long as that is defined and available as part of your retention schedules to end users, there's definitely different ways to go. This question goes to the same topic. What is the difference between current and creation plus? That might be something that really is, kind of a very similar thing. We don't oftentimes see or recommend current, using the event trigger current in the retention schedules, because it tends to be something that can leave a little bit too much discretion and interpretation to end users and can be kind of ambiguous. So, current and creation plus can very well be synonymous, but however you're defining it, again, just make sure it's consistent. What is the difference between until superseded and current plus? Kind of the same thing. If your end users are asking, if you're asking that question, your end users will be asking that question. How can you potentially define it more clearly? Because superseded very well could refer to be synonymous with current plus. So just, kind of make sure that everything aligns in a similar manner. We had another comment come up. I suggest current year in place of creation. And they said creation plus X years may be perceived as disposition is required at the time of inactivity or obsolescence, which would be difficult to keep into compliance. Current year broadens the time period to manage disposition regardless of the day within the current year the document was produced. And so I think that is a good point, and, I think this also sheds light again on how are you defining these event triggers? Is it tied to the current year? Is creation, is it the creation or capture of the year within which it was created or captured? So that's, I think, another example that really does go to a definition, can really help kind of clarify this if end users are not sure.
And Jen, if I can jump in there just to make a kind of an additional statement on that, within our records management software, we actually do have those distinctions where even if you say it is creation plus, in the definition of creation date, you can specify whether the retention should go to the day or if it just goes to the end of the year for whatever period of time is selected. So again, just kind of underscoring the need for clarity and defining your rules as far as how they're applied.
Do you often see, Warren, that end users need to schedule to a specific day rather than calendar year, or is it more common to kind of defer to a calendar year type disposition process?
More common to defer to the end of the fiscal or calendar year. Some people do destructions quarterly, some even monthly, but rarely are they monitoring that on a daily basis, just because of the work involved in approvals and execution of those.
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Warren, that even if you're doing a creation plus and scheduling to the day, without some kind of automated system notifying you when a schedule is due for disposition, logistically, most people do dispositions, regularly at like a quarterly interval or annually, but hopefully not as much annually, hopefully more quarterly. So,
right.
We had another user comment, or I'm sorry, a viewer comment. Our company used the word active, but the retention schedule was revised, for example, to now indicate current year +7. I think this is something we see more and more, and we try to stay away from using the term active. Again, it's, maybe even a little bit more difficult, I think, than current. Active has a lot of, there's a lot of subjectivity that can go into that in kind of, what does active mean? I mean, for an end user, active could mean like, I want to keep this just in case, that's an active reason for end users. So that can be kind of a slippery slope, I think. And so kind of getting away from active, active could mean a life of account. It can mean the life of asset. It can mean current year plus, this. So if you can take active and really kind of provide some event triggers that are more kind of, the nomenclature is more reflective of the life cycle of the records and provides just kind of more direction, is a little bit more decisive. I think that this company's choice to kind of move away from that was probably good. And that's what we are seeing more and more, and we definitely recommend. And other triggers include after completion, closure, after audit, while active expiration. Absolutely. I think these are all really good triggers. I think when you go through a retention schedule simplification, one of the goals is to reduce event triggers as much as possible, make sure they're clearly defined. And anytime you can do that, you provide some, additional clarity and simplicity to the retention schedules, and the end users benefit from that. And so like I see after audit, completion, after expiration, after completion, closure, these are event triggers that are reflective of the life cycle of the records and are, I think, important. Do we ever see the use of life of company plus X years? That's a question here. Yes, we do. And in fact, there are legal requirements that require this. And so, yes, we absolutely do. And, typically this is in relation to like board of director records, shareholder meeting records, shareholder records. And oftentimes those regulations or implementing this type of retention period guarantees that, if a subsidiary or even, the holding company or, the company itself really dissolves or it's divested or whatnot, certain records are retained for a period of time thereafter in case, there's ongoing liabilities and or pursuant to like the legal requirements. So we do that. We also see clients that don't do that. And instead they have a different process where they kind of address those ongoing record keeping requirements once, the company is no longer active. And how do we apply retention?
Hey, Jen.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I was thinking maybe Warren's got a call at the top of the hour, so let's have him go next with some of his slides, and then we can extend past if we need to, or at least I can.
Okay. Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Thanks, Rick. And a lot of mine don't necessarily require showing my screen, as we can save some time there as well. But some of the questions that we had dealt with some of the file plan situations, as well as just specifics around versatile retention. So with regard to file plans, this is in section 4. one of the questions is about whether Versatile offers the support of creation of file plans. And if we're talking about Versatile retention, that's really outside the scope of that particular product, but it is something that we do in the Versatile, the records management tools such as Versatile Enterprise, Versatile Professional, et cetera, where you're creating essentially a plan for how you will store the records, whether they are storing active files on a shelf or boxes in a record center. But a file plan typically deals with the record series and the structure of that, and is somewhat of a legacy concept now, because the idea behind file plans in the past was how do you best put your records into a physical space so that you can easily retrieve them and find them. That is now not as much of an issue when you can easily search for records by multiple criteria and be able to be told where those records exist. So yes, we can do that in other tools that we have, but not as much of an issue as it used to be in the past. Another question is about whether the system can export entire sets of records or schedules as structured data, and indeed it can. So for example, in the Versatile retention program, we have export buttons on just about every screen that you can export to CSV files, as well as any of the reporting system files or report templates can be exported to Excel spreadsheets. So you can take whatever columns and structure that you want and take the result of a search and export that to a spreadsheet as needed in order to get that out into kind of a structured table to use in other forms. We can even do direct interactions with other databases if needed. So if that sort of ties into integrations, we definitely have some options there. And then in terms of related questions to the software, one, this is dealing in section 6 with Versatile retention itself. One of the questions was, if the organization isn't ready to commit to a software solution such as Versatile, are there any homebrew solutions that you can recommend as a stopgap while working on BuyIn to purchase a solution? And I would say probably the most common there is just the good old spreadsheet or Access database. That seems to be the database of default for any kind of a homegrown solution. Sometimes people will develop their own solutions, but it gets costly and ends up taking a lot of resources and time. So something simple like that is probably the best way to go. And that way, when it comes time to actually move that into a formal retention schedule management tool, it's much easier to import from a spreadsheet versus say from a Word document or a PDF because of the structure that's there. So that's always a good plan. In a similar kind of question as far as the tool itself, one was about, is there need to do or implement an automated data scan and classification before I'm able to use this tool? And I would say not necessarily. So doing a data inventory ahead of time can certainly help, especially if you are developing a retention schedule. It's a good first step to help you with understanding what records you have and how you're going to classify those, but definitely not a requirement, especially if you have maybe the starting of a retention schedule that you want to put into the system and then manage it from that point forward. You can certainly do that. And even if you do want to conduct a data inventory ahead of time, it doesn't necessarily have to be an automated scan. Those tools are great, but it depends on your budget and your needs as far as how you want to conduct an interview like that. Another question dealt with the citations themselves. So if I have Versatile retention and we only do business in the US, would the global information be something I could use? Well, it depends first of all on the subscription, because we do offer US only or North America or international subscriptions. And you can certainly use the international subscription even if you're only doing work in the US, if you need to see a reference to those other citations. Obviously the cost is going to be higher, so you have to make sure that you can justify that cost. But you can certainly use that as another reference point if needed.
On the other end of that, Warren, you can limit the jurisdictions that you see to only include your specific jurisdiction. So for example, if you were in a handful of US states and you had a US subscription, there are ways to set up your company so that when you run searches, you select your company and it only lists the requirements in your jurisdiction.
Yeah, good point, Rick. Absolutely, because I don't think anyone, well, at least not very many companies work in all, 130 or so countries that we're dealing with, right?
Right.
So the last one on my list of questions is about whether the program has a mechanism to set calendar reminders when documents are reaching their retention. If so, can the reminder be broadcast to multiple individuals in the company? So that's really more of a records management function, again, versus a records retention schedule function. So versatile retention as a product is more about the policy, managing the rules and regulations and definitions, whereas records management is about implementing that policy on given records. And so in that case, yes, if you used a tool like Versatile Professional or Versatile Enterprise, where it's tracking the individual records, indeed, we can have reminders that go out when records are due for destruction, and it can go to multiple people. That's all customizable, so that's certainly something we can do for you. So with that, it looks like it completes my list. So I will let you guys continue, and I'll drop off. Thanks so much for letting me be a part of that that panel. Great discussions. I was really loving all of the interaction that we had and all the questions. So looking forward to getting additional responses to that. Take care, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks, Warren.
Warren. Okay, why don't I just go ahead and circle back? There were just a few more points to talk about on triggers. And they were actually both, these last two are kind of very similar actually. So how do you apply the retention rules to large policy manuals where different sections are updated at different times, but the overall policy needs to be managed in its entirety for regulatory compliance purposes? So we do see this issue. The other comment was the policy retention is not clear for keeping old versions. So we see this issue. I think the question is, I mean, oftentimes they're grouped together. So we'll see expiration of policy or the life of the policy. And, you know, oftentimes those amendments, riders or whatnot are kept alongside or as part of that policy. Now, because they relate to a prior version, there may be ongoing liabilities in relation to that prior policy version. So I think it goes to determining, you know, do these need to be broken out? Can they be kept for a shorter period of time rather than the life of the policy? Maybe it is something like superseded, retired plus a certain amount of years. And can they be kind of broken out and retained for a shorter period of time? If that is the case, then, you know, that's a possibility. Although, you know, typically we do see all of those records kept for the life of the policy. But if the records are super voluminous and you have you can keep them for a shorter period of time, of course, that's something you can consider to breaking those out.
And that's me, right? We had a couple questions on archival records. First, it was we're still in triggers, Michelle. How are archival records handled? And then I'll kind of deal with that one first. So there are kind of two things going on with that question that come to mind. For most retention periods, the trigger is going to be the period of time when the records are actively being used, and the number of years specified after the trigger is typically the archival period. Now, that's not always the case, but it works for a lot of clients and in a lot of industries. If you're in a situation where your triggers don't align with the record's active use, consider adding a separate field to your records retention schedule to inform, you know, what's active use versus what's the archival period. Now, that's kind of the records lifecycle management aspect of the archival records. The other aspect is you're going to have these historical records that are going to go into an archive and pretty much live on indefinitely. Many clients just bucketize those in one category of records and have a historical record for that, set it permanent. But this other question asked, how do you implement when using a permanent retention? So when you do that, you don't have that trigger date / event to control the date the record should be transferred to the archives. And so I think that's another one. We're having another field to specify the active versus archival period is going to be needed, especially where it's a big bucket of archival records like historical records, where they may be actively used for different periods of time before they go into the archives. Another option though, and we had a comment that talked about this during the presentation, if there is a trigger that aligns with the active use for a permanent category of archival records, you could have a trigger plus 99 years with the policy that anything noted at a long-term retention of 99 years is in essence permanent. And that will allow you to, have that active use and know when to transfer after the active use to the archive. That's it for triggers. And so next, let's go into section 4, which is file plans and departments. And so Warren already touched on this a little bit on the versatile retention side with talking about creation of file plans and exports of legacy schedules. But here's another one that relates more on the kind of consulting side of things. Can you have a separate audit retention schedule for each department so they could be boxed together? We have audits for accounting every year, so this would be more of a logistics in both gathering the documents and information for the auditors. And so one option, again, and we've talked about this already before, is to tie categories together using a separate field within the retention schedule. So logistically, this could work by indicating which categories are relevant to a specific audit so that you could generate a report by filtering by that particular audit. In versatile retention, you'd be able to generate a report based on that UDF, user-defined field. So if more granularity is needed, which I assume is probably the case, because individual records are going to be relevant to this and not categories of records, and so I would track these items with an inventory that's mapped to the records retention schedule. That way you can go to the record level and indicate which ones are relevant to an audit, filter by that, and be able to report on that. And as far as the storing of records in specific places, that's another place where a file plan, I think, is a great way to deal with and plan for how they're organized. And then the records retention schedule is going to feed the inventory the retention period. So, Warren kind of discussed it within the software side of things for Zasio being a distinction between versatile retention, which is the records retention schedule rules manager, and then our other line of records management software, which helps you set up file plans and you can create more granular listings of your records and inventories there. And so next slide is 5, executive buy-in and approvals. Yeah, so this was a great question. We get approval. We have to get approval for any changes to the retention schedule. If we consolidate, that means approval from multiple different directors, executives. Do you have suggestions or tips on how this might benefit them to help get buy-in? And I can start on this one, but I welcome input. And I'm sorry that Warren left because I would have liked to have heard his thoughts on this. But I think the way that, optimizing your retention schedule is going to benefit the executives and the people that you're trying to get buy-in from is especially relevant where you have concerns that the retention schedule isn't being followed. If you know that there's confusion, if you know that there's a problem with user adherence, that's one place where I think you're worse off not having, or the only thing worse than not having a retention schedule is having one and not following it, because if you've got one and you're not following it, you know better. And so, yeah, I think if you have a retention schedule and you have concerns that it's not being followed because it's too complex or difficult to understand, the buy-in is that you're out of compliance with the policy, which could result in some bad things as far as if litigation happens or if regulators are looking for records that you can't provide, things like that. And so there's a compliance aspect to it. Another thing is that if there is user adherence, a larger retention schedule is difficult and potentially expensive to maintain. Laws are dynamic, so maintenance is a necessary thing to keep your records retention schedule up to date. Departments and structures of organizations are constantly changing, and so aligning the processes helps keep the retention schedule evergreen. And so optimizing your records retention schedule makes maintenance easier and less expensive. So those were kind of the two buy-in points that I had to go to directors and executives with. Oh, you're muted, Jen.
I would add too, I think that simplification of a schedule in a way is a big change. It's kind of an overhaul of the schedule. And I think a lot of our clients, when they start these initiatives and we work with them, they're thinking, this is a chance for us to start fresh, kind of with our stakeholders, maybe new approaches. A lot of times our clients use this as an opportunity to get people away. Now that it's a functional schedule, people are sharing different areas, different record series. It's not necessarily end user focused. The record series aren't necessarily just catered to the needs of one individual. It's really an opportunity for them to re-examine the retention periods of their schedule. And with privacy in mind, a lot of this is also, let's get the retention periods as tailored as possible to the legal requirements. Let's re-examine business operational needs, see if we really need to keep these records permanently. Can we get them to, kind of discuss this and kind of re-examine? And so I think, overall, in addition to the administrative ease that comes with and the increased end user adherence with the simplified schedule, it's an opportunity to kind of re-examine those retention periods and see if there's areas for risk reduction in that regard as well. Get rid of some of that over retention. So there's I think a lot of different opportunities here. It's an opportunity to re-engage with end users and kind of get them really on board and really involved in the records and information management program as well. So I think there's definitely a lot of different angles you can come at with this type of initiative.
Yeah, privacy is a great one. And speaking of privacy, let's skip to section 7. We had a couple questions that touched on it, and they were great questions. I'm just going to read off these questions. Apart from regulatory action or reputational damage, what is the actual risk posed to a data subject if we keep data for longer than is necessary? Can you give some examples of negative side effects on data subjects? So that's a great question. And then another one that's along those same lines. Can you share your thinking you mentioned about statutes and limitations regarding privacy? And so the bad news is that privacy is its own beast, and talking through these questions would take an entire webinar in and of itself. And so we don't have time today for that. We're already over by a few minutes, I can see, if keeping this under an hour. So the good news, though, is that we're going to talk about these questions and give you some other tips to optimize your records retention schedule considering privacy during our August 5th virtual coffee webinar, which will be at 9 a.m. Mountain Time, so 11 a.m. Eastern Time on August 5th. If you haven't joined us for a virtual coffee session yet, it's a casual forum to ask questions about pain points or questions trending on RIM topics. And so for this one, we're going to submit the topic as privacy. We've got these 2 questions already submitted that we'll be talking about. And you can also ask questions live, pre-submit questions, or just listen in. And there's no pressure to volunteer your name or company information. We can keep that stuff anonymous from other attendees if you do want to participate. So For more information on that, check out the news and knowledge page on Zasio.com. And
Thanks,
that's it. I
Rick.
think we're through them
And-
all.
Yeah, thanks, Rick and Jen. We hope you all found today's question and answer session to be a helpful resource and to kind of complement our initial webinar. If you do have any follow-up questions for either organization, you can reach out to us using this contact information. And then, like Rick said, be sure to join us for virtual coffee. And then we'll also be sharing some information. We do have a new version of versatile retention coming out. So I think we will be offering a demo there. So we'll be sure to send that out in the follow-up email when we share the recording with you all. So have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
See you next time.